every time you hit one of those critical milestones, you need to reevaluate your business case.
Welcome to LifeSci Continuum. Today, I'm speaking with Laurel Nelson, founder of InnovexDx.
A lot of the companies that I work with got a lot of funding during COVID because everyone was funding scientific companies during COVID and now are really running out of funds.
Laurel partners with clinical, diagnostic, and life science companies to lead innovation excellence and successful commercialization of novel products and services.
What specifically is this product going to be used for? So we can go to the FDA, things like clinical pathways, clinical adoption, clinical utility, health economic studies that you need for CMS in order to get reimbursement.
We get right into how to avoid some of the specific pitfalls companies face when launching a product, particularly when they have a limited budget.
Companies big and small want to go as broad as possible to make as much revenue as possible, but really being very specific about here's my product, here's what it does, here's the value proposition it brings to the market, here's who's going to use it, and here's how they're going to drive value so that you can just get the revenue going while you pursue, all the other dreams.
All right, let's go. Why don't we start with your background? How did you get into the space and what are you doing today?
Well, I initially, when I was in college, received a degree in molecular biology and was pre-med, thought I was going to go to med school. And then I thought I was going to be a PhD student at studying developmental biology. Got my first job at a school, was making $28,000, and the woman with the PhD next to me was making $31,000, and I was living in San Francisco. So I figured that math equation didn't work out so well. So I started applying for industry jobs and actually got a job at Bio-Rad Laboratories out in Hercules, which is one of the top 10 clinical diagnostic companies in the world. And so I was introduced to the world of laboratory medicine at a very young age. Kind of got right into marketing, product management, and then really for the next 25 years have worked for different companies, working with R&D to build laboratory diagnostic products, and then really focus on commercializing those products out to either physicians or laboratory customers to use in diagnostic settings. So I've been in the routine diagnostic space. I launched the first system for PCR testing for H1N1 with the CDC, did a lot more in infectious disease, and then spent about a decade in transplant diagnostics. So lots of passion there for the patients and what I do. I went out on my own as a consultant in August of 2024 to bring all the tools and tool sets and best practices that I've learned throughout my career to focus more on the founder-led or the smaller startup space to bring my expertise to help them commercialize products.
What do you see today with sort of these smaller startups? They're obviously running on a smaller budget, depending on their level of funding. What do you see as the challenges in launching a product with a limited budget?
Well, I think because of all the market challenges, the challenges have changed significantly. A lot of the companies that I work with got a lot of funding during COVID because everyone was funding scientific companies during COVID and now are really running out of funds. And then because of the changes in the scientific funding in the United States in general, they've gone from kind of having a lot of cash to not being able to get cash. And so there's a big pivot that's needed to really understand the critical path items that are needed to get the product to market. So not only can they go back to the investors and say, realistically, this is what I need to do now in these market conditions, but then also there's a lot more attention to detail when it comes to the execution process. And that's where I'm really trying to come in because, when cash is flowing and the investors are investing, you don't have to make really hard, quick decisions. But right now, what I'm seeing is the need to make really hard, fast, effective decisions and stay the course to get over the end ramp to get the product to market.
Okay. So thinking about that, what are some of those decisions? What do they look like? Where would you start?
One of the ones I see a lot is just finalizing the product. I think for some of these smaller companies, the R&D teams are very creative and they like to iterate, but that whole concept of meet your customer requirements, freeze your design, verify that the product is working according to specifications and get it into a customer's hands to test it outside of your laboratory. Those are some of the decisions that I've seen that are actually hardest to make. There's like this concept of iteration, but then you never really are able to launch a product. Some of the other decisions are, how narrow or big do you go from a reimbursement standpoint? Do you pursue reimbursement? Do you try to do a private pay model? How big is your scientific advisory board and KOLs? And then sometimes it's even, who are your end customers and indication for use? A lot of companies, big and small, want to go as broad as possible to make as much revenue as possible, but really being very specific about, here's my product, here's what it does, here's the value proposition it brings to the market, here's who's going to use it, and here's how they're going to drive value so that you can just get the revenue going while you pursue, all the other dreams.
So particularly on that last point, we often will see, founders come in with a deck and they have TAM out there, and they make this projection of all of the billions of dollars of valuation that they'll have. And what they don't realize is that as a startup, that's just not a realistic scenario. That to gain traction quickly and early, you really need to be looking at individual use cases and segmenting out for that. We talked a little bit earlier, a little bit about value proposition. Where do you see maybe founders struggling a little bit with that?
Where I've seen it is, and this again, it's newer companies, bigger companies, is typically these companies are started because there's a scientist who's walked in the customer's shoes, right? They've been in that scenario, they've been the customer, and they have a really good idea about something that may solve a problem. But that idea maybe is not verified, that it actually will solve a customer problem. And then what I see is usually products 2 and 3 are just creative ideas where there's really no customer input. And so one of the things that I've always stood for in my career, especially from a product management and marketing perspective, is I like to represent the voice of the customer and to make sure that we're pressure testing. Is this important to the customer? Can they pay for it is another big question. And is it worth the change, the actual pain of change of changing a behavior to adopt the product? So I don't, that's where one of the challenges are, is they're thinking through, like, I'm solving a technical problem, but not necessarily are you solving a customer environment problem with that product, because that really is your value proposition.
Right. The context of the problem, there are a lot of external factors beyond just solving the problem. And we could talk about that a bit. I do actually see that a lot. Is there isn't we'll edit this out because I'm kind of stumbling on this thought, but I get this sense that when a scientist or an engineer goes down the path of becoming a founder, developing a product, doing the research, going through some of the development, pitching to investors, they still see themselves as exactly the perfect customer. And they don't realize that along that journey, they've changed. And the things that are driving them and the motivations are really different than the engineer or the scientist who's still working at a bench and dealing with internal factors. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, and sometimes even the scientists don't understand the environmental factors that are involved in actually purchasing a product. So, for example, if you go ask a laboratory director, what is your total gross margin on this based on the reimbursement that you're getting or based on your total cost of ownership? And they don't really, I mean, like the budget department, finance knows that, but they don't necessarily know that. And so I think that they know the technology really well, but they may not know anything about how you get reimbursement or really how it's being paid for by the organization, or, a number of peer-reviewed publications that need to be done in order to bring something to market. So, and then to your point, when they bring it back to a company, they're thinking about it as far as like revenue generating, whereas that typically takes a long time to get a product to market, and things will change. And so the minute you leave that environment, I think you always, as a company, and this is where I like to come in, is just kind of like keep pressure testing your ideas to make sure that they're still solving a problem, because the markets change, the competitive environment changes, things change on a day-to-day basis. And I think once you're not in that environment, you lose sight of even newer factors that are influencing the purchasing decision. Like staffing, for example. Sometimes it's just hard to get staff that are trained to use the complex products.
Agreed. So what are some of the other challenges that they have to deal with when launching a product, especially with a limited budget?
I think making really good use of your resources, and that comes down to an area where I like it kind of at day one. And I do have a couple founders that I'm working with that we haven't even solicited investments yet, but they are self-aware enough that they know they need a full business plan and path to commercialization before asking for the funding. And so I think one thing, and I always hear, oh, we're building the plane while we're flying it, like that's a good thing. And I'm like, no, we need to
100%.
The wings aren't going to fall off. Just to sit down and take the time. And this is where I try to bring value to my customers is I have this long commercialization checklist that I go through that is literally like, you need to think about all these things before you put a go-to-market plan together. You don't need to do all these things, but you really want to make sure that you don't forget something that's really critical because it's not on your radar. So really sitting down and doing the planning and then making conscious decisions about, I've decided to do this, but not this. And here's the trade-off on my revenue at the end of the day. And then being very clear with the key stakeholders, whether it's your board or investors, or if you're at a big company, right, your leadership team, this is what I need to be successful. And then building that credibility by following the plan. One of the biggest challenges I see with some of the smaller companies is they're literally like winging it, making new decisions every day. We should go do this and go do this. And they just like burn through cash doing that. So planning isn't fun. Most people don't like it. I do, but I think it's really critical to be successful.
I agree. I think that, sometimes under the guise of being agile, it's really fragmented thinking and distraction. And you really need to be able to balance that's, the speed of kind of that entrepreneurial thinking,
right,
with a little bit of pragmatic. Yeah, ideas are great all day long, but we have to execute. The money pit is not never ending. And so understanding, in my space, a lot of what I do is helping founders understand that they have blind spots. They have areas that they're not interested in. It's not on their radar. They just can't see it as important. That's not how I should be spending their time. And they probably shouldn't be. They should rely on partners. Yep. And that does require a bit of trust. To trust a lot of times a relative stranger to look out for your best interests while you're working.
Yeah, I agree. And I've observed that, because you said something that's very interesting that I've observed, is that the details of the execution are not interesting. It's the science that is interesting. It's the publications, it's the inventions. And then not only being self-aware to bring in someone that knows and enjoys the execution piece and can do it well, but the willingness to sort of understand that piece as well, because a lot of the words that I use when I'm talking about a commercial execution strategy are very different than the words that the scientists are using to talk about their product. So sometimes I feel like I need to really explain why all of these things are important, other than just like, I've been doing this for 25 years and just kind of trust me type thing. Why should I spend money doing this? So it is definitely, but I see that also as just a level of like, that's not why I'm doing this. I'm not interested in that. Like, I just need someone to like bring it to market, but they still need to be invested. They still need to know what's going on.
Yeah. It's funny that you talk about education. I was speaking with a client the other day. We were talking about how the engagement was going, and he said, I would not change a thing. Everything is going really well, except that I feel like you try to teach me too much. And, we spend time on this education piece, and I just don't really want that. I want you to just do the work. And in the work that I do, they really do need to understand what we're doing and why we're doing it, so that they can make better decisions along the way. They don't need to be as deep in it as we are, but they need to have a fundamental understanding of the process. Give me an example. You mentioned how some of the language is different in how maybe the scientist founder would describe it versus what you're doing.
When I talk about things like narrowing down intentions for use, intended use, like what specifically is this product going to be used for, so we can go to the FDA. Things like clinical pathways, clinical adoption, clinical utility, health economic studies that you need, right, for CMS in order to get reimbursement. Publication strategy, they usually understand, but it's really more of those, like, the kind of the clinical FDA speak, I guess, is when you need to bring something to market that they're like, what is clinical utility versus analytical utility, and verification versus validation, and all this stuff in industry that, you've all been in rooms debating the meanings. But I think at this point we really understand where, when I say, we really need this 3 to 5 year reimbursement strategy and demonstrate the health economic impact on the overall healthcare system from using this assay, or even things like, well, what is the doctor going to do with this information? How are they going to treat the patient differently? It's like, well, I didn't think about that. So it's some of those conversations that I get into where, because they're not really coming necessarily, sometimes it depends on who, from a clinical utility perspective, they're coming from a scientific perspective.
I agree. And a lot of times they just don't know the questions to ask.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know what you don't know until it pops up and it derails your program.
Exactly.
So, thinking about this, a big piece of sort of working on a limited budget is always having an eye out for some kind of conversation around investment.
Mm-hmm.
And I think every founder dreams of being able to, go to market without an external investment partner of some
Mm-hmm.
kind, because it provides a lot of flexibility and opportunity later on. But eventually, so many companies have to go the investment route. Thinking in terms of how my brain as the clinician or scientist works, how do I get credibility with an investor when my brain might be wired a different way?
I think that's a really good question, and something that I see founders that reach out to me struggling with a lot. And I've had a couple really interesting conversations even in the last few days. Is I think some have this idea that because they have an idea and they've kind of sketched it on paper, that they're going to get all this money. When in reality, the VC world is, you show me something that's generating revenue already and I'll help you ramp, right? It's kind of like the private equity stance. Whereas even getting into the angel networks and the small, seed funds, the challenge there is, I think there's some money, but I actually literally went through a pitch deck with one of my founders that we tried to really make business oriented and not science, not clinically oriented. But there was still words in there like 5-year survival rate if you get diagnosed in stage 1, right, for cancer, for example. We all know what that means if we've been in the clinical industry, but it's kind of a third party person that works with investors to help sort of connect the dots. We were reviewing with him and he said specifically, like, well, what does that mean? And there were still some gotchas in there that if we had just gone and pitched to investors, they probably wouldn't understand kind of why it's in there and how it conveys value. And so I think there's a big gap between what the scientists are presenting and what the investors understand as how to evaluate opportunities. And then also a big gap in the expectation of, like, well, of course I'm going to get $5 million versus they're like, okay, well, you need to get $100,000 from your, grandparents and get this going and show proof of concept. And then maybe we can get a talk. So that's where I see a lot of frustration and rub. And I see a lot of founders actually spending a lot of time networking and going to investors and trying to get money up front. Whereas in reality, they should probably get grant money or save up or, get some money in other ways so that they can kind of focus on, like, building the value prop of their product and be ready. I don't think that they're ready to go to the investors at that stage.
Yeah, I think friends and family is always probably an easier sell, depending. But it's like anything. It's easier to get money when you already have money.
Exactly.
And I think that with investors, you have it's a bit of a spectrum. You have some that really understand the science and they're really deeply knowledgeable. And then you have others that maybe not so much.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to, it's like when we write for a certain grade level for the audience, you have to
Right.
understand and craft your pitch. It's not one pitch for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
It's not one product for everybody. You really have to tailor whatever you're doing, your message, your marketing, your product positioning to very specific cases. I like that a lot. So, kind of thinking through this, we've talked a little bit about sort of getting started and working with investors. Let's talk about the business itself. So, I'm dealing with a company right now where the founder is an engineer.
Mm-hmm.
I think of it as like a garage engineer, a tinkerer. I
Mm-hmm.
have an idea. I want to, I'm kind of in my garage, working on some things. Taking that and commercializing it, manufacturing,
Right.
dealing with things like tolerances.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really different world. Getting it tested, making sure it works, and that you can actually supply the market if you end up, commercializing and selling it. Talk a
Mm-hmm.
little bit about what you've seen there and maybe some of the challenges that founders deal with, especially if they're a bit tight on budget.
Yeah, I would say this one in particular, I've seen major corporations struggle with too. It's like they understand the product development process and they understand the sales process. And there's just this idea that if you have this cool product and you get the best sales guy in the world, it'll just sell. And the whole verification, validation, transfer to manufacturing, early access testing, supply chain management is just like not on the radar unless you have really experienced people on your team. And so where I've seen, one of the biggest struggles I've seen is that once they get the product into the customer's hands, whether it's for a clinical trial or if it's RUO out to early access, it just doesn't work as designed because it's only the people that develop the product have used the product. So there's never been that external verification. And that is always put it out there, bring it back, put it out there, bring it back. And that burns your customer relationships over time. So that's the number one thing that I always like to see is external validation. The second is transfer to manufacturing. And I've been surprised at some of the large companies that don't actually fully transfer their products over to manufacturing. They're still being built by R&D. And that speaks to, how robust are your processes and, all these things that you think are kind of written down and normal. But when you have your R&D teams doing your manufacturing, they're not doing R&D and then your pipeline's slow. So actually putting in the effort to transfer to manufacturing, I think is really, really important. And then I've also seen some big challenges in just securing supply chain. So things like secondary vendors, or even was it one company that was just buying off the shelf polymerase for their diagnostic assays with no lot to lot control of performance. And then the assays would just stop working, so it's just one of those things where thinking about operationalizing, and it's not fun for creative people to think about operationalizing, but it's like, how do I make this reproducible and scalable such that when I am successful, I'm not having hiccups over back order because I don't have a secondary vendor for one of my critical components, or I'm having problems with quality because I don't have receiving specifications that I'm testing to in QC specifications. So it's all that, stuff that it's either not interesting or maybe it takes too long in some areas where it's like not even on their radar. But like I said, you want to be successful, which means you're going to scale at a rapid volume, which means you have to have all those wheels turning it. And those are the areas where I've seen all companies kind of, struggle at the end of the day. And if you have a quality issue or you go on a major backorder situation, your customers will leave you, so that's like the last thing that you want to do after you go to market.
It's funny. You said a few things there that sort of perked up my ears. We see quite a bit in, founders saying, well, I'm really passionate about this part of it. Mm-hmm. And we'll just deal with that when we get to it.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So when do you think is the right time for them to really thinking about manufacturing and supply chain?
Well, I think they should have their plan laid out up front. It doesn't mean that they need to execute on it. But, for example, if you're developing a lateral flow assay, obviously having someone that can manufacture that at scale, you should have that in the plan. And so the way I like to think about it is not doing everything at once, but having a plan and then phasing out where those activities are. So, you don't need to transfer to manufacturing if you have a completed verification. But if you complete verification, you should have your manufacturing plan pretty well detailed so you can start to execute on it. And I think that's where I see the value of using a phase gate process, which many large companies do. And you can tone it down so it's not just a lot of process and red tape, et cetera. But I think getting the basic elements of that. What does feasibility look like? What does verification or development look like? What is verification? What are those milestones? So that you have a process you're using to. For me, also, it's what quantitative data are you using to know that you should go from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3, right? It's not, I hear a lot like, oh, it looks good. The data looks good. I'm like, what does that mean? Right? What values are you hitting that you know that if you take this and go to the next phase, that it's going to be successful? So just basic planning like that, and then being thoughtful in what you need to do in order to move to the next phase. But you should never be in the situation where you're like, oh, I'm launching this product and I don't have a supply chain plan. Right? It should be well thought out.
Right. I've got no way to deliver on it. You mentioned phase gate. Just define that quickly, and maybe for founders who might not be familiar with it and aren't going to open Google or ChatGPT and look it up. Get the quick overview of how they might implement something like that pretty quickly that helps them down the road.
Well, most larger companies, regardless of their industry, will use a phase gate, what's called a phase gate development process. And essentially what that is there's a couple key phases of a project, and there's a guiding board. Usually it's like the CEO and executive management that you use this phase gate process to understand what the exact steps are in the product development process, and then what are the key criteria to get from one phase to another. So typically the first phase is a feasibility phase where you are looking at the market feasibility. Will customers buy this? And you also look at technical feasibility. Is this something that someone technically can build? And together, from a product management R&D perspective, you create the business case that then gets funded. And so you're doing a little bit of work before you're getting the funding. But as you go through each phase gate, you essentially get refunded by whoever the stakeholders are. And you also show the market data and the product data that you're ready to go to the next phase. So typically it's feasibility, and then product development, verification. And then if you're in a clinical space, validation, which is your clinical trial. And then, there's a transfer to manufacturing process in that, and then a full commercialization. And often most phase gates will also include a post-market phase where you're looking at customer adoption data. Are we meeting our plan numbers? Do we have quality issues? Do we have, need to change things in product support? But there's some pretty basic ones that out there. Like I said, you can chat GPT it and they'll give you a really nice one, but it's really just a decision-making process. And then also making sure, where I see the value, is that all key stakeholders are aligned, because sometimes R&D will decide to change the product, but the business people don't know that, right? And they're out trying to sell to customers already, and they're selling something that isn't reflective of the product. So making sure that the right people are in that process, both to be lockstep that you're moving forward, but from an alignment perspective, I think it's really important.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Let's just kind of travel back a minute to one of the first things you mentioned, which is market data. Will people buy this? Mm-hmm. So I'm a founder. I've been sort of struck by this inspiration, and I just have all this excitement. Like, I've solved the biggest problem in my market. And what we see is that they, it's that build it and they will come, and then nobody shows up.
Right.
So it goes back to your founder and one salesperson, and how come we can't move this thing? Mm-hmm. So maybe what are some kind of quick ways that a founder could get some information on the market and maybe test it with real data? So they're not spending their time on something that people aren't going to buy.
It's a great question. And I mentor a very small company, PhD students, that we just had this exact same conversation because they're trying to figure out where their market is for this concept that they have. And, obviously you could get external kind of, does the market exist data? That's really important. But you can do basic product concept testing, even with some of the, like what you would put into a pitch deck, and just really, get some time set up with who you think the end customer is, and go through and get feedback from them of, well, first of all, you should always start with what are your challenges, right? But that's typically before you actually develop the product. You need to understand what are the challenges, what problems are they having, where do they see the market going in the future? But if you already have an idea or even a concept, you can product concept test that by getting feedback on, will this solve their problems? Typically they'll say, oh yeah, sure, whatever. Would you buy this? How much would you buy this for? Where would you get the funding to buy it from, right? Especially in the sciences, you're either grants or reimbursement or something. And then I always like to talk through, what would you need to change in order to buy this? Is it a purchasing process? Is it the type of person employed in your lab? Is it a training process? Is it a IT process that would need to change? Because that's where I've really seen, even if you do your voice of customer up front and your product testing, where I've seen things really kind of falter is like, I didn't realize it was a 9-month queue to get on IT's radar to get this software installed.
Yes. So, SAP. We saw the same thing with a client who had monitoring software, and they're like, we can inject all that data right into SAP, and IT was like, no, you can't.
Yeah, exactly. It's like you have to do more work uncovering your barriers than you need to do actually understanding why your product's going to sell. And I think that's 100%. Really important to do. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and something I've seen that has been really effective is finding the right conference or the right trade show, and just walking the floor. You don't need to have a booth. You carry your bag with you. You find your peers and you have conversations with them. You show them your beta product, and you let them poke at it, and take their challenges and their input as market research. It's not a critique. It's a viability. The other area that we found really interesting to look at is distributors. Distributors can give you a sense of what's happening in the market that a customer might not be ready to. So definitely some opportunities there. Let's take a moment and let's talk about market access. And I think that's an area that founders, particularly if they're, they have a background in the space, they were working on the bench or, in the OR, they are familiar definitely with our situation here in the US. But they may underestimate maybe the complexity of navigating that. So talk about that a little bit. What have you seen?
I have seen companies do market access really well and then market access really poorly. And by poorly, I mean, exactly to your point, is they completely underestimate what's needed to get the data that's required to convince these basically government institutions to allow you into the market or to fund you. I think that's an area that really needs specific planning because it's expensive. And they also, I think there's a concept that like, well, I've done my analytical validation to go to FDA. And once it's FDA cleared, I should be able to get reimbursement, right? That's not necessarily the case because the groups involved in getting reimbursement are, the AMA that wants to show clinical utility, which is a different study than demonstrating analytical utility. So analytical is, does it test for compound A? Yes, no, with what level of, specificity? Clinical utility is really, if I test a patient with this, does it actually improve their outcomes right, through a treatment or management? It's a whole different study, especially if you're doing something prospective. That could be 3 to 5 years and a couple of $1 million versus what you're doing for a clinical trial. And then there's the CMS component, which is really about health economics, where you need to prove that if this test is used, it's going to take cost out of the healthcare system somewhere. If you use this test, you're less likely to hospitalize a patient, which will save you, $10,000 or something like that. So I think it's really thinking through all the different types of studies that need to be done. And then I've seen companies big and small go down this path where they get there and they're like, okay, we've launched the product, we've gone to FDA, now we want to think about reimbursement, and they don't realize that's like a $10 million investment. And then they go, oh, that's too much. We'll try to launch the product without a funding strategy. Now you can actually scrape the private pay market. There's functional medicine. There's a lot of things that are out there that aren't required, don't necessarily need to have Medicare reimbursement right up front. But I've seen several companies launch products that are never used because they haven't really taken seriously what they need to do from a funding perspective to get people to actually have money to buy the product.
Yeah. And in some cases you can get the patient to pay out of pocket. We had a client that was in a retinal scanning area, and they just treated it like that, have the patient, when they go in, take this test and pay out of pocket. But not everybody can really travel that route, and they just don't think about it.
Right.
So you mentioned something about being transparent and clear with investors and key stakeholders. Did you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. And it's not just investors. I've seen this in my corporate life as well, is that, you go typically upfront with a business case. I'm going to make X amount of money in 3 years. And then reality happens and it takes longer to launch the product, or it's not as easy to develop from a technical standpoint, or your big competitor that you didn't realize was going to launch a product has completely disrupted the market. What I haven't seen, and what I really advocate for, and that's why I like using the phase gate process, is you have to go, every time you hit one of those critical milestones, you need to reevaluate your business case and the market to make the decision that, is this still worth launching or not? Because if you're 3 years late on your development, then competitors are coming, maybe the price is dropping. Because that's one of the critical issues that I've seen, is that, it takes 3 to 5 years, like for systems, for example, 3 to 5 years to develop the system. If you're not updating your business case, things change. Then you go to market with your original sales plan from, 5 years ago, and then they don't hit the sales plan, and then guess what? People get fired. It doesn't go very well. So you constantly have to readjust your expectations and be very clear, because once you lose, especially with investors, I think once you lose that credibility, there's only so many times you can go back and say, we thought it was this year, but it's actually going to be next year, or this thing has popped up, or that thing has popped up. I think it's better just to be really clear and transparent up front and do that planning than go back and re-ask for funds or explain why you're not hitting your deadlines.
Yeah, so you make a good point, and I kind of want to hammer it home. So 2 things, but part of the challenge I see is mentally founders get sort of frozen in time with where they were when they sort of transformed from the customer, the user, to the entrepreneur. They sort of use that slice as their reference point going forward. And I think that's a big mistake for the reasons that you talked about. The other thing is, and there's a word for this phenomena, but it's this idea that somewhere else in the world, someone else is also working right now to solve this problem. So every client I ever work with, we're the only ones doing this right now. I'm like, you're never the only one doing it. There's always at least one other person trying to solve this problem right now. So having some amount, take the blinders off, recognize your blind spots, having some amount of competitive intelligence, what's happening in the space, is really important as you go.
Absolutely.
Because who knows, maybe you'll even learn something from what somebody else is doing, but you can't just ignore it. There's just no way.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, especially in areas like, cancer, where everybody is developing some sort of AI cancer app or, tailoring therapies. I literally had a conversation with one company when I first went out on my own that was in a specific indication of cancer. And it was the same thing, like nobody else is doing this. And I realized a day later, there was another company doing the exact same thing, basically across the street, in the same town. And so I think that's what's been really interesting too, being a consultant, is even when you work within the companies, regardless of your role, you can get really, have the blinders on and get really like narrow vision. Whereas it's interesting now. And I think that's one of the areas that as consultants you bring value to, is when people come to you with ideas, you can say, that's really interesting. But so somebody's already tried to do that. Here's where the challenges are, of course, not breaking confidentiality or anything, but being able to kind of be out in the market and understand all the different things that people are trying to do. One, there's a lot of really good approaches for patient care being developed out there that I think really should be funded and brought to market. But you also see a lot of the duplicity that's out there. So you can make recommendations on maybe you want to modify it a little bit, or because there are a lot of people trying to do the same thing, and not everyone's going to win.
So if you could, maybe 3 quick actionable tips for a founder who's starting out today that will save them a ton of pain down the road.
First tip, bring in a business colleague to help you flush out your business plan and your go-to-market approach and your product market fit to make sure that you should spend time on this in the first place. Second, once that's a yes, as you start to seek investment, do your full go-to-market planning, full commercialization planning. Sit down, go through every single item, identify what you need to do, identify the money that it's going to take, and identify the resources that you need and the type of expertise. And then thirdly, I would say, make sure you lock your product design, lock your plan, and execute, but measure along the way. You shouldn't just blindly execute, but changing decisions and changing features will always delay. So make sure you have your measurement criteria in place too, to know if you're being successful or not as you launch, and then just, keep focus moving forward.
Very nice. Very nice. Last question. You can time travel and go back to, just starting out in your career, Laurel. What advice would you give yourself that, what you didn't know then that you know now?
I would say be patient. I think we all want to rush to be successful. And, whether as individuals or our career path or as founders bringing products to market, and, be patient and just learn as much as possible and build the skill sets and the tools and really be clear about your end game. And I think this applies to people's professional careers as well as, if you start a company. And that's one thing that comes up a lot is what is your end game? Do you want to sell to another company? Do I want to go off on my own and be a consultant? Do I want to be super VP of, a very large company? And really understand what the trade-offs. That's another thing that I think is common between careers and product development is you can't have everything, right? You have to figure out along the way what's really important to you and what trade-offs do you have to make, and are you okay with those trade-offs? And again, I think that applies to developing products as well as developing your careers. I think I was very much in the let's climb the career ladder, and then kind of realize that maybe that's not what I want to do, because I want to spend time with my family and I don't want to travel 50% of the time. So I've gone out on my own to do this, and then figure out also what's important to you and what motivates you. And where I kind of am in my life right now, the projects that I'm really interested in are these cool scientific ideas that we could potentially bring to market because they have the potential of changing patient care, truly. And that's not necessarily the philosophy of some of the bigger companies. And so that's why I'm trying to do this on my, with my network of colleagues that I've worked with for a long time is, it matters to me to have expertise and influence over enabling another company or individual to be successful. That's what gives me, gratification at this time versus maybe that was not what I was thinking, early on.
Sometimes it takes a bit of time and a bit of a journey in trying some different things. I do encourage a lot of the, product development professionals and entrepreneurs to really find their superpower and double down on that. Don't try to be great at everything. Pick something and really focus on that, and then surround yourself with like-minded, but, also talented people. So, Laurel, thank you so much. It was great talking to you today. This has been great.
Thanks, Bill. Appreciate the opportunity, and been a great conversation.